Story number 1. In the rolling hills of Robertson County, Tennessee. In 1817, the land held secrets darker than the shadows cast by its ancient oaks. The Bell family, John, Lucy, and their 9 children, lived a quiet, prosperous life on their farm. Unaware that something malevolent was watching, waiting to tear their world apart. This isn't just another ghost story. It's the only case in American history where a supernatural entity was officially blamed for someone's death, documented by the state government itself. It began with a strange creature in a cornfield, but it would end with a curse that echoed through generations. For 4 years. The Bell family endured a nightmare that drew crowds, confounded scholars, and even unnerved a future president. This is the tale of the Bell Witch, a force so vicious it left a mark on history that still chills the soul. The Bell family's farm, nestled near the Red River, was a haven of hard work and faith. John Bell, a respected church elder, was known for his honesty and strength, a man who built his life on solid ground. They were practical, hard-working people who had built their lives on solid ground. But one summer day, John's world shifted. On that fateful day in 1817, when John Bell encountered the bizarre creature in his cornfield, their world would be turned upside down forever. It was unlike anything he'd seen, a dog's body with a rabbit's head, its eyes gleaming with unnatural intelligence. He raised his rifle and fired, but the creature vanished into the air. That night, the family's log cabin came alive with disturbances. Strange knocking sounds on the walls began, faint at first, like a curious hand testing the wood. The Bells searched for animals or intruders, but found nothing. The nights grew restless, the knocks growing louder, more insistent, as if something was demanding entry. The disturbances were subtle at first, scratching sounds in the walls, the sound of rats gnawing, and occasional thumping noises that seemed to move throughout the house. But soon, the phenomena escalated into something sinister. Invisible hands began pulling covers off beds in the middle of the night, leaving family members shivering in the cold. The children woke to find their blankets on the floor, their rooms icy despite the summer heat. Heavy furniture would slide across floors on its own, and the sound of chains dragging through the house would wake the family from their sleep. The Bells, practical and God-fearing, tried to explain it away. Faulty beams, settling wood, but no explanation held. The family searched everywhere for the source, but found nothing. The disturbances seemed to follow them, growing bolder, as if the house itself was turning against them. Young Betsy, only 12, became the entity's primary target. Invisible hands would slap her face, leaving red handprints on her cheeks. Her screams echoed through the cabin as her hair was pulled, her arms bruised by unseen pinches, but no one could see what was attacking her. The entity seemed particularly focused on tormenting this innocent child, pinching her arms and legs until they were covered in bruises. Betsy's suffering drew the family together, but also left them helpless. There was nothing visible to fight against, nothing physical they could confront or drive away. The attacks grew more violent. Betsy was lifted off her bed, her body shaking in midair as if held by invisible hands. The other children huddled in fear, while John and Lucy prayed for deliverance. Word of the Bell family's plight spread throughout Robertson County, and curious neighbors began visiting the farm to witness the phenomena for themselves. What they saw turned skeptics into believers. Chairs moved across rooms without touch, candles flickered out in still air, and Betsy's cries filled the night. What they saw defied all rational explanation and converted even the most skeptical visitors into believers. The entity, once silent, found its voice. At first, it was just whispers and mumbled words, but gradually it developed into a clear, distinct voice that could carry on conversations with anyone in the room. The voice called itself Kate, claiming to be the spirit of Kate Batts, a local woman who'd clashed with John Bell over a land deal years before. Kate Batts was indeed a real person, an eccentric woman known throughout the community for her sharp tongue and vindictive nature. She'd cursed John publicly, vowing revenge. When the entity claimed to be Kate's spirit, it demonstrated intimate knowledge of the dispute and expressed the same bitter hatred toward John Bell. But Kate Batts was alive, living miles away, making the entity's claim impossible. The entity's knowledge seemed limitless and impossible. It recited sermons from distant churches, word for word, as if it had been there. It would quote entire sermons from churches located miles away, reciting them word for word as if it had been present during the service. On one chilling night, it recited 2 different sermons simultaneously, one from a Methodist church 13 miles to the north and another from a Baptist church 15 miles to the south, speaking both sermons at the same time in different voices, never missing a word. Ministers who visited were stunned when their private prayers were repeated back, thoughts they'd never spoken aloud. As news of the Bell Witch spread beyond Robertson County, it attracted visitors from across Tennessee and neighboring states. Scholars, reporters, and skeptics arrived, expecting a hoax, but left shaken. Newspaper reporters came to investigate and left as believers, writing detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. The entity thrived on the attention, moving objects, speaking in multiple voices, and debating theology with a knowledge that spanned centuries. The entity seemed to enjoy the attention, often putting on elaborate performances for visitors, but its cruelty toward Betsy never ceased. Her hair would be pulled so violently that she would scream in pain. The family tried charms, prayers, and even burning sage, but nothing stopped the torment. John Bell, once a pillar of strength, began to fray under the entity's relentless hatred. It would curse him with language so foul that visitors were shocked, threaten him with violence and predict his death with gleeful anticipation. The visit of General Andrew Jackson truly legitimized the Bell Witch case in the eyes of the public. Jackson, a war hero, arrived with a retinue determined to uncover the truth. As soon as his wagon reached the Bell property line, the wheels mysteriously locked up and refused to turn. His men found no mechanical fault. The Bell Witch's voice rang out clearly, welcoming General Jackson to the farm and giving permission for the wagon to proceed. The wheels turned again, as if released by an unseen hand. During his stay at the Bell farm, Jackson witnessed phenomena that he later described as the most extraordinary events of his life. Furniture moved, voices spoke from empty air, and one of Jackson's men, a self-proclaimed witch tamer, was driven off the property by invisible forces. Jackson himself was reportedly so unnerved that he cut his visit short and left after just one night. The entity's attacks on John Bell grew relentless. The constant stress and terror began to take a severe toll on John Bell's health. His hands trembled, his speech faltered, and his body weakened. He developed a nervous condition that caused his tongue to swell, making it difficult for him to eat or speak. The entity mocked his suffering. Claiming it was the cause, it would taunt him about his declining condition, claiming credit for his suffering and promising that worse was yet to come. By 1820, John was a shadow of himself, confined to his bed. On the morning of December 19th, 1820, John Bell had been feeling particularly unwell and had taken to his bed early the previous evening. The next day, the family found him unresponsive, his body cold and rigid. On the nightstand beside his bed was a small vial containing a dark, smoky liquid that no one in the family had ever seen before. The entity's voice filled the room, gloating. "I gave old Jack a dose of that last night while he was sleeping," it said. "He'll never get up from that bed again." The family tested the liquid on their cat, which died instantly. The family immediately threw the vial into the fireplace, where it exploded with a bright blue flame that shot up the chimney. John Bell died on December the 20th, 1820. The attending physician, Dr. George Hobson, was so convinced that supernatural forces had caused Bell's death that he listed the cause as supernatural on the official death certificate filed with the state of Tennessee. This makes John Bell the only person in American history to be officially recognized as a victim of supernatural murder by a state government. At his funeral, the entity's voice mocked the mourners, singing crude songs. After John Bell's death, the Bell Witch's activity began to diminish. It grew kinder to Lucy, calling her Old Luce and aiding with chores. It also seemed to have developed a special relationship with John Bell Jr., often engaging him in lengthy conversations. The entity made a chilling promise that would haunt the Bell descendants for generations to come. It vowed to return in 7 years and again in 107 years, true to its word. In 1828, strange phenomena began occurring again at the Bell farm, though they were less intense. The entity's voice returned briefly, then faded. The Bell Witch case remains unique in American supernatural history, not just because of its official recognition by state authorities, but because of the sheer volume of credible witnesses and documentation that supports it. The farm is now a tourist site, where visitors report strange voices and moving objects. The case also highlighted the complex relationship between belief, fear, and social dynamics in early American communities. The Bell Witch remains a haunting reminder that some forces defy explanation, reaching across time to settle old scores. Story number 2. I never believed in monsters until that night. My name is Kathleen May, a beautician in Flatwoods, West Virginia, raising 2 boys, Eddie and Freddie, in a quiet mountain town where nothing much ever happened. That all changed when my boys ran home, breathless, talking about a fiery object crashing into the hills. They were playing football in the schoolyard when they saw a bright object streak across the sky, slowing down before vanishing behind a hill on the Bailey Fisher farm. I thought it was just kids' imaginations, but their wide eyes and shaking voices told me this was real. The air felt wrong that evening, heavy with a stillness that made my skin prickle. My boys begged me to drive them to the crash site to investigate. I was skeptical, but their story matched, and I couldn't ignore their fear. I insisted we bring others for safety, so we recruited Eugene Lemon, a 17-year-old National Guardsman, and his dog. 2 more boys, Max Lockhart and Ronald Shaver, joined us, and we piled into my car, hearts pounding with curiosity and dread. The road to the Fisher farm was dark, the hills swallowing the last of the daylight. As we approached the area where the boys said the object landed, a strange, acrid smell hit us, burning our noses and throats. It was like chemicals and metal, sharp enough to make my eyes water. We parked and started climbing the hill, Eugene leading with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dense woods. The dog, usually bold, stayed close, its ears pinned back, sensing something we couldn't. Halfway up, we heard it, a low, pulsing hum, like the ground itself was alive. The red glow grew brighter, coming from behind a large oak tree in a clearing. It pulsed in rhythm with the hum, hypnotic, pulling us closer even as fear clawed at my chest. Eugene raised his flashlight, and what we saw froze us in place. A creature, towering at least 10 feet, loomed before us, its round head glowing red, encased in a pointed hood that looked ancient and wrong. Its eyes were the worst, 2 burning red orbs staring right through us. Those eyes showed an intelligence that wasn't human, and something cruel, like we'd trespassed on forbidden ground. The creature's body was dark, shapeless, floating just above the earth. It moved toward us with a fluid motion that broke every rule of nature we knew. We ran, stumbling down the hill, branches tearing at our clothes. The dog ran ahead, desperate to escape. The smell clung to us, burning my lungs and I felt watched, like those eyes were still on me. We made it to the car, hearts racing, some of us gagging from the smell. Several of us felt violently ill, with nausea and trouble breathing. I was so sick I needed a doctor, but he had no answers. By morning, Flatwoods was alive with whispers. A. Lee Stewart, a local reporter, came to investigate. Initially skeptical but convinced by our consistent stories, he took us back to the hill in daylight. And what we found made my blood run cold. There were skid marks in the ground, like something heavy had landed, and the trees were scorched, leaves blackened without fire. The grass was flattened in circles, and that chemical smell lingered. The story spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country picked it up, and investigators flooded our town. Air Force men from Project Blue Book came, poking around, saying it was just a meteor and a barn owl. We rejected that. Owls don't leave skid marks or burn trees. Or locals knew there were no barns up there. And those eyes weren't any birds. The attention was overwhelming. But we stood by our story. Weeks later, others reported strange lights and marks on their land, some before they'd even heard our tale. That night changed me. I started noticing things, flickers in the woods, shadows that didn't belong. Once, I found a strange mark on my porch, like a claw had scraped the wood. I burned sage, hoping to cleanse whatever followed us home. My boys never played in the hills again. And Eugene, brave as he was, admitted those eyes haunted his dreams. Years later, he told me he saw them in his sleep, watching, waiting. Flatwoods embraced the story, building a statue, holding festivals. But for us, it wasn't folklore. It was real. And it marked us forever. Story number 3. High above the Pisgah National Forest, Brown Mountain looms, its dark forested slopes and rocky outcroppings a silent sentinel in the ancient Appalachian chain, under a sky heavy with stars. A strange glow flickers along the ridge, not firelight, not starlight, but something otherworldly. The lights manifest as glowing orbs of various sizes and colors, pale yellow, orange, or red, dancing, hovering, and moving independently across the mountain's ridgeline. They weave through the valleys, darting with purpose, as if guided by an unseen hand. Unlike any known natural phenomenon, these lights display what can only be described as intelligent behavior, seeming to respond to observers, to those who stand on the overlooks, hearts pounding. The Brown Mountain lights feel alive, watching back, their silent dance a mystery older than the mountains themselves. The first documented sighting came from John William Gerard de Braam, a German engineer conducting a survey of the region. He stood atop a rocky outcrop, his instruments useless against the spectacle unfolding before him. His report described numerous lights appearing and disappearing at regular intervals along the mountain ridge, lights that could not be attributed to campfires, torches, or any known source. A man of science. De Braam had no framework for what he saw, no folklore, no stories, just the raw truth of the glowing orbs. His professional credibility made his account significant, as he recorded the phenomenon as part of his official duties. Yet, as he watched, a chill settled in his bones, a sense that these lights were more than mere optics. They were aware. The Cherokee people, who had called these mountains home for millennia, had their own explanation. One steeped in sorrow, they spoke of a battle long ago, where warriors fell in droves, their bodies strewn across the slopes. The lights, they said, were the spirits of Cherokee women who died of grief, searching for their lost husbands, fathers, and sons. Their torches burned eternally, a testament to love and loss that refused to fade. This explanation gave the lights a deeply human and tragic dimension, resonating with all who witnessed them. To stand on Brown Mountain was to feel the weight of centuries, of hearts broken and spirits bound to the earth. The lights became part of local folklore as settlers poured into the region, their stories echoing the Cherokees. Hunters, travelers, and farmers all saw the same orbs moving with purpose, defying explanation. Witnesses from different backgrounds described glowing orbs that appeared at night, moved independently, and displayed behavior suggesting intelligence. The consistency of these accounts was uncanny, as if the mountain itself was speaking, its secrets glowing in the dark. The idea that the lights represented love transcending death struck a chord with everyone who saw them. By the time the nation took notice, the lights were no longer just a local tale. They drew curious minds, skeptics, and believers alike, all eager to unravel the mystery. The Brown Mountain Lights had become a phenomenon, a challenge to science and a whisper of the divine for those who stood on the overlooks, the air thick with anticipation. The lights were more than a sight. They were a feeling. A connection to something ancient, eternal and utterly unknowable. What were these lights? And why did they dance on Brown Mountain alone? The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched endlessly before the small town of Morganton, their peaks cloaked in mist and mystery. Brown Mountain stood apart, its rugged silhouette a beacon for those drawn to the unexplained. The locals spoke of the lights in hushed tones, sharing stories over campfires and diner counters. Some called them a trick of the eye, others a gift from the spirits, but all agreed on one thing: to see the lights was to feel changed, as if you'd brushed against something beyond the veil of the world. A young researcher named Clara Hayes arrived in Morganton, her backpack stuffed with notebooks and a camera rigged for low-light photography. She'd heard of the Brown Mountain Lights in a university lecture, a footnote in a geology class that sparked an obsession. Clara wasn't a believer in ghosts, but she craved answers, driven by the same curiosity that had led de Bram to his quill centuries ago. She set up camp on an overlook off the Blue Ridge Parkway, her equipment ready to capture what science had failed to explain. As night fell, Clara waited, her eyes trained on the ridge. The air was cool, the forest silent, save for the rustle of leaves. Then it happened. A faint glow, pale yellow, flickered into existence above the tree line. The lights appeared, hovering, darting, grouping together, and separating in patterns that suggested purpose. Clara's breath caught as she adjusted her camera, her hands steady despite the thrill. The orbs moved like dancers in a silent ballet, weaving through the air, sometimes fading, sometimes flaring brighter. As if aware of her gaze, she wasn't alone. A small group of locals had gathered nearby, their faces lit by the soft glow of their phones as they recorded the spectacle. One, an older man named Eli, shared the Cherokee story with Clara. His voice low and reverent, he spoke of the women who died of grief, their spirits condemned to wander, carrying spiritual torches in their eternal vigil. Clara nodded, respectful but skeptical, her mind racing with scientific possibilities, gas emissions, electrical discharges, anything to ground the lights in reality. Yet, as she watched, the orbs seemed to pause, hovering closer to the overlook, almost as if aware of being watched. Clara's equipment hummed, capturing data, but her heart told a different story. The lights weren't just phenomena, they carried a weight, a sadness that pressed against her chest. The emotional impact of witnessing the Brown Mountain Lights was profound, a mix of awe and inexplicable sorrow. She stayed until dawn, the lights fading as the first rays of sunlight touched the ridge, leaving her with more questions than answers. The mystery of the Brown Mountain Lights had drawn others before Clara. In an early attempt to explain them, the United States Geological Survey sent a team to investigate, suggesting the lights were reflections of locomotive headlights from the Linville Valley. The theory seemed plausible until a great flood swept through, destroying the railroads and silencing the trains. Yet the lights continued to appear with the same frequency and intensity, undermining the locomotive theory. The USGS returned with better tools, their researchers camping on the slopes, their notebooks filled with observations. They confirmed the lights were real, not illusions or misidentified sources, but could not explain their behavior. Clara dove into the archives, reading reports from decades past. The USGS had proposed new theories: spontaneous combustion of gases, bioluminescence, mineral discharges, but none accounted for the light's intelligence. The lights seemed to respond to human presence, becoming more active when observed. Clara's own data echoed these findings. Her infrared cameras detected no heat signatures, her electromagnetic sensors no disturbances. The lights defied every model she knew, existing in a realm science couldn't touch. She met with Daniel Caton, local astronomer who'd studied the lights for years, and he confirmed the lights were genuine, appearing consistently after sunset, more active on clear, low-humidity nights. His stories of the lights approaching observers, hovering near groups, sent a shiver down Clara's spine. They seemed to perform, moving in patterns that suggested intentional display. Dr. Caton's voice carried a mix of wonder and frustration. He'd seen the lights dozens of times, yet their nature remained elusive, a puzzle that mocked his instruments. Clara returned to the overlook night after night, her skepticism eroding with each sighting. The lights weren't just orbs, they were storytellers, weaving tales of loss and longing across the mountain. She began to see the Cherokee legend not as myth, but as a framework for understanding something beyond science. The idea that the lights represented love, transcending death, resonated deeply. The mountain itself seemed to hold memories, its ancient rocks whispering secrets to those who listened. Clara's research became an obsession. Her nights spent on the mountain, her days poring over Cherokee oral histories. The locals welcomed her, sharing their own encounters, hunters who'd seen the lights follow them through the woods, tourists who'd felt an inexplicable sadness as the orbs danced. The Brown Mountain Lights had become part of the cultural identity of western North Carolina, featured in festivals and viewing areas along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Yet, for all the attention, the mystery endured, untouched by modern tools or theories. One night, Clara brought a Cherokee elder, Mary, to the overlook. Mary's eyes gleamed as she recounted the story of the grieving women, her voice carrying the weight of generations. The lights were their spirits, she said, bound by love and sorrow, searching forever. As they watched, the orbs appeared, brighter than Clara had ever seen, moving in a slow, deliberate circle. Mary smiled, unfazed with fear, as if greeting old friends. The lights seemed to respond, hovering closer, their glow softening as if in acknowledgement. Clara's camera captured the moment, but it was her heart that understood. The lights weren't just a phenomenon, they were a bridge between the living and the dead, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. The Brown Mountain Lights embodied the themes of Appalachian folklore, the connection between the living and the dead, the power of love and grief. They challenged her to look beyond data, to see the mountain as a keeper of stories, its lights a reminder that some mysteries are meant to endure. Years later, Clara would return to Brown Mountain, no longer a skeptic, but a storyteller herself. The lights continued to be observed by hundreds each year, from tourists to researchers. They danced, as they always had, eternal and unyielding, a reminder that the world still held wonders beyond explanation. The Brown Mountain Lights were a humbling reminder that despite our advances, there are mysteries that defy us, connecting us to the ancient wisdom of those who came before. Story number 4. I was never one to believe in ghost stories or things that go bump in the night. Growing up in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, life was simple. Folks worked at the chemical plant, fished in the Ohio River, or crossed the Silver Bridge to Ohio for supplies, but that all changed when something came to our town. It wasn't human, wasn't animal, and it brought a fear I'd never known before. A fear that still lingers in my bones. And the Silver Bridge was our lifeline, a suspension bridge stretching across the river, carrying folks to and fro. I'd driven over it 1,000 times, never thinking twice. But one night, while working late at the diner, I felt a chill that wasn't from the autumn air. It was like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I'd heard whispers, folks talking about strange lights, odd shadows, but I brushed it off until I saw it myself. I was driving home, the road dark and quiet, when my headlights caught something by the old TNT plant, a place nobody went after dark. It stood tall, taller than any man, with wings folded against its back. Its eyes were what stopped me cold, 2 red orbs, glowing like fire, staring right through me. I froze, my hands trembling on the wheel, knowing whatever this was, it wasn't from our world. The thing didn't move at first, just watched me. My heart pounded, and I wanted to floor it. But those eyes held me, like they were pulling at my soul. Then it spread its wings, wide, dark, and silent, and lifted off the ground. Gliding toward me, I hit the gas, my old pickup rattling as I sped down the road. It followed, keeping pace, its shadow blotting out the stars above. I'd never been so scared in my life. I made it to town, shaking, and the thing vanished into the night. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't shake the feeling that it had wanted something from me. The next day, I heard others talking, folks who'd seen the same creature, felt the same dread. We started calling it the Mothman, though nobody knew what it really was, and all we knew was it wasn't here to hurt us. It was trying to tell us something. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, a small industrial town that in 1966 was home to about 6,000 residents who lived quiet, predictable lives centered around the local chemical plant and river commerce. I'd lived here all my life, working shifts at the diner, serving coffee to truckers and locals. The town's most prominent feature was the Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge built in 1928 that connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, carrying thousands of commuters and travelers across the Ohio River every day. It was our lifeline, our connection to the world beyond. But that creature changed everything. The first encounter occurred when 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clinton in West Virginia. About 90 miles from Point Pleasant, they said it flew over them, silent, with wings like a bat and eyes that burned red. They ran, leaving their tools behind. I didn't believe it at first, thought it was just talk, but then I saw it, and I knew they weren't lying. The sightings kept coming. 2 young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette, were driving near the abandoned West Virginia Ordnance Works, a former World War II munitions factory known locally as the TNT area. They saw it standing by an old generator plant, estimated to be between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a massive wingspan that Roger Scarberry later described as being 10 feet from tip to tip. Its eyes, 2 large hypnotic red orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light, locked onto them. They sped away, but it chased them, gliding effortlessly at speeds no bird could match. I heard their story at the diner, their faces pale, their voices shaking. Linda Scarberry later described the experience as the most terrifying moments of her life, saying that the creature's eyes seemed to look directly into her soul, and that she felt a sense of overwhelming dread that went beyond simple fear. They went to the sheriff, and Deputy Halstead took them seriously, and although they found no trace of the creature, Halstead noted that all 4 witnesses were genuinely terrified and that their accounts were consistent and detailed. The town buzzed with talk, The creature was dubbed Mothman by copy editor Bill Powell of the Point Pleasant Register, who was inspired by the Batman television series that was popular at the time. Soon, everyone was talking about the Mothman. Over the following weeks and months, reports of Mothman encounters poured in from across West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. Folks from all walks of life, cops, firefighters, farmers, saw it. Witnesses included police officers, firefighters, construction workers, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life. One woman, Connie, a hairdresser from New Haven, told me her story. Carpenter reported that the creature landed on her car and kept pace with her vehicle for several miles. She said its eyes filled her mind with strange images, like warnings she couldn't understand. She described feeling paralyzed with fear and said that the creature's eyes seemed to communicate with her telepathically, filling her mind with images and sensations that she couldn't fully understand or describe. I started to notice a pattern. Everyone who saw it felt something bad was coming. I began keeping a journal, writing down every story I heard. Some folks said they dreamed of disasters, bridges falling, rivers flooding. Others had phone lines cut out or saw strange lights after seeing the creature. Many witnesses reported that their encounters with the Mothman were accompanied by feelings of impending doom, of visions of disaster, or premonitions of tragedy. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Mothman was trying to warn us. The sightings grew more frequent, the creature appearing closer to town, and witnesses described the creature as becoming increasingly agitated and active, appearing more frequently and in more populated areas than it had during the earlier phases of the phenomenon. I saw it again one night, near the Silver Bridge. It hovered above the river, its eyes fixed on the bridge like it was studying it. I felt a knot in my stomach, a sense that something terrible was coming. Then it happened. On the evening of December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge was carrying its usual heavy load of rush hour traffic when a critical structural failure occurred in one of the suspension chains. The bridge collapsed into the Ohio River, taking 46 lives with it. The failure happened without warning, and within seconds, the entire bridge collapsed into the icy waters of the Ohio River, taking with it 37 vehicles and 46 people who died in one of the most tragic bridge disasters in American history. I was at the diner when we heard the news. The town was shattered, families gone, lives lost. After that, the Mothman was gone. After the bridge collapse, the Mothman sightings in the Point Pleasant area ceased almost entirely, as if the creature's mission had been completed. I couldn't help but wonder, had it been trying to warn us? The timing of the bridge collapse in relation to the Mothman sightings was impossible to ignore. Those red eyes, those dreams of disaster. It all pointed to the bridge. I started digging into the stories. A journalist, John Keel, came to town, asking questions. The connection between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge disaster was explored in depth by journalist John Keel, who spent extensive time in Point Pleasant investigating the phenomenon and interviewing witnesses. He thought the Mothman was something beyond our world, maybe something that could see the future. Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1975, documented the encounters in detail and proposed that the creature was some form of interdimensional being or supernatural entity that had the ability to perceive future events and was attempting to warn humans about impending disasters. The town was never the same. The psychological impact of the Mothman phenomenon on the Point Pleasant community cannot be overstated, and folks were scared to go out at night. Kids had nightmares about those red eyes. The bridge collapse coming so soon after the peak of Mothman activity left many people convinced that they had witnessed something truly supernatural and prophetic. Some felt guilty, thinking they could have done something if they'd listened. Years later, I found out the Mothman wasn't new. Wamsley's research has revealed that similar creatures have been reported in the Point Pleasant area, both before and after the famous 1966 to 1967 wave of sightings, suggesting that the Mothman might be a recurring phenomenon rather than a single, isolated event. Old-timers talked about winged figures in Native American stories. shadows that haunted the rivers long before the bridge was built. His work has also uncovered historical accounts of mysterious winged creatures in the region dating back to Native American times, indicating that the Mothman might be part of a much older and deeper mystery. Now, Point Pleasant has a festival, a statue, a museum. The town of Point Pleasant has embraced its connection to the Mothman legend, establishing an annual Mothman festival that attracts thousands of visitors from around the world. But for those of us who lived through it, it's more than a tourist trap. Like for the people who lived through the Mothman phenomenon and the Silver Bridge disaster, the experience was life-changing in ways that went far beyond the immediate trauma of the events. It opened my eyes to things I can't explain, things that make you question what's out there. I still live here, still work at the diner. Sometimes, late at night, I look out toward the river and wonder if it's still watching. The legacy of the Mothman continues to influence how we think about cryptid encounters and paranormal phenomena. It taught me the world is bigger than we know, that some things, maybe guardians, maybe warnings, move in the shadows. It serves as a reminder that there are still mysteries in our world that challenge our understanding of what is possible and what is real. Story number 5. I grew up hearing whispers of the mountains, tales of spirits and creatures that guarded the old ways, but nothing prepared me for the truth behind the Wampus Cat. It's not just a story to scare kids. It's a warning, etched in blood and shadow, about what happens when you cross lines you were never meant to cross. I learned that the hard way, deep in the Appalachian woods, where the air hums with secrets older than time itself. The forest was alive that night, not with the usual sounds of owls or wind, but with something heavier, something watching. I was young, too curious for my own good, drawn to the forbidden rituals my people kept hidden. The elders spoke of sacred hunts, ceremonies that bound us to the land, but they were for men alone. I wanted to know why, to see what they saw, to feel that power. That was my mistake. I crept through the trees, wrapped in a mountain cat's hide, my heart pounding with every step. The men were gathered in a clearing, their chants rising like smoke, calling to spirits I couldn't name. I thought I could stay hidden, just watch from the shadows, but the spirits saw me. They always see, and they don't forgive. The air turned cold, sharp, like a blade against my skin. I felt it before I understood. A tingling, then a burning, as the hide I wore started to cling to me. Not like clothing, but like it was alive. My body changed, twisted, and my mind followed, torn between human fear and something wild, something hungry. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was becoming something else. By dawn, I was no longer myself. I was cursed, forever caught between woman and beast, doomed to wander these mountains. The Wampus Cat, they call me now, a monster born of my own curiosity, and every time I see a hunter straying from the old ways, I feel that hunger rise, that need to remind them. Some boundaries are sacred, and crossing them comes at a price. My name was once a Hioka, and I grew up in a small community nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, where the Cherokee traditions shaped every part of our lives. Long before European settlers ever set foot in the Appalachian Mountains, the Cherokee people had established complex spiritual traditions that tied us to the land, the animals, the spirits. Among the most sacred of these traditions were the hunting rituals, ceremonies that kept the balance between our world and the wild. These rituals were viewed as fundamental spiritual laws, and breaking them could bring ruin to us all. The hunting ceremonies were exclusively the domain of men, and women like me were forbidden from even knowing their details. When I was young, described as beautiful, intelligent, and deeply devoted to my husband. But I had a flaw, an insatiable curiosity about the mysteries that the men guarded so fiercely. Night after night, I'd listen to their preparations, catching whispers of chants and rituals that sparked something in me. When I wanted to know, to see, to understand what made these ceremonies so powerful. My chance came during one of the most important hunting expeditions of the year, a sacred hunt that would ensure our survival. The men gathered in a secret location deep in the forest to perform their rituals, and I couldn't resist. I wrapped myself in the hide of a mountain cat to blend into the shadows and crept toward the clearing. For hours, I watched as the men performed ancient dances, chanted sacred words, their voices weaving a connection to the spirits. I saw them take on the essence of the animals they hunted, moving with a power that felt both sacred and dangerous. The knowledge was overwhelming, like a fire in my chest. What I witnessed that night was knowledge that had been kept sacred for countless generations. A bridge between life and death, human and spirit. But I wasn't meant to see it. The spirits that governed the hunting rituals were ancient and powerful, and they knew I was there. Their anger was a weight pressing down on me, and I felt it before I understood, a tingling in my skin, like the hide was fusing with me. The transformation began slowly, a strange warmth spreading through me. The cat hide seemed to merge with my own skin, no longer a disguise but part of me. My fingers ached as my fingernails began to grow into sharp claws. My teeth sharpened into fangs. My spine twisted. My mind began to change as well, my thoughts blurring with instincts I didn't recognize. Hunger, rage, the need to hunt. By the time the men left, my transformation was irreversible. I was no longer a Hyoka, not fully human, not fully beast. I had become something caught between the two worlds, a creature cursed to roam forever. The spirits had cursed me to spend eternity as a warning to others, a guardian of the sacred laws I'd broken. I was condemned to wander the mountains forever, neither woman nor animal, unable to return to my people or find peace. My appearance was terrifying to behold, a creature upright like a human, but with the claws, fangs, and fur of a mountain cat. My eyes glowing with a light that wasn't mine. I could still think, still feel the weight of my punishment, but the hunger drove me, pushing me to stalk the forests, watching for those who disrespected the old ways. The Cherokee people who encountered me called me the Wampus Cat, a name whispered in fear. I would appear to hunters who were preparing to violate sacred laws. My presence a reminder of the balance they had to keep. I moved with a speed no animal could match, slipping through the shadows. My voice a mix of human cries and predators' roars. When settlers came, they brought their own folklore and superstitions, twisting my story into tales of witches or demons, but they all agreed the Wampus Cat was a creature to be feared and avoided at all costs. Years later, outsiders reported seeing me in the hills, a creature that matched the old stories. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a large ape-like creature that stood upright, covered in dark fur, with eyes that burned in the dark. They didn't know my story, didn't know the Cherokee ways, but they felt the same fear. The newspapers called it a mystery, sent search parties, but I was gone, back to the shadows. The witnesses described a creature that matched the traditional accounts almost perfectly, and I knew why. I was still out there, still bound to my curse. The elders, like Robert Bushyhead, say the story of the Wampus Cat serves multiple purposes within Cherokee culture. It's a warning about the dangers of forbidden knowledge, a reminder to respect the laws that keep our world in balance. For the Cherokee, the Wampus Cat is not simply a monster, but a tragic figure. My suffering, a lesson for all. The creature's eternal punishment is seen as both just and necessary, a sacrifice to protect our people from their own mistakes. That curse is my reality. I wander these mountains still, watching, waiting. I see hunters who forget the old ways, who take without giving back. And I show myself, a shadow in the trees there, a growl in the dark. Some nights, I feel her, the woman I was, crying out for release. But the spirits don't listen. They made me a guardian, a warning, and I'll carry that burden forever. So heed my story, respect the boundaries, honor the laws, or you might find me watching from the shadows, ready to remind you what happens when you cross the line. Story number 6. I stood at the edge of Otter Creek, where the water runs black as ink under a sky that never seems to clear. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of secrets that clung to the trees like moss. Folks in Clay County whispered about this place, called it Booger Hole, a name that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who'd heard the tales. I'd come to trace the story of a woman they said sold her soul to the devil, a woman whose shadow still lingers in these hollows. Every step I took felt like a dare, like the mountains themselves were watching, waiting for me to turn back or fall. Otter Creek winds through some of the most isolated and mysterious terrain in all of West Virginia. The ridges rise steep and jagged, their peaks swallowed by mist, their valleys hiding things no one dares speak of in the light of day. It was along this creek, in a place that locals had long called Booger Hole, where the trees grow so dense the sun barely breaks through. I'd heard the stories growing up, tales of the Thorn family, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. The Thorns were an established mountain family, but not the kind you'd want as neighbors. Their reputation extended far beyond their immediate community, built on fear, not friendship. They weren't just eccentric, they were something darker, something that made folks cross the road rather than pass their land. I wasn't sure what I'd find, digging into the past like this. But the deeper I went, the colder the air felt. The creek babbled beside me. But it wasn't a comforting sound, it was like a warning, low and urgent. I'd heard about Grandma Thorn, the matriarch, a woman whose name alone could hush a room. They said her eyes could see right through you, straight to your sins, and her voice could make your blood run cold. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but standing there, with the shadows stretching long and twisted, I felt her presence, like she was still watching from the dark. The matriarch of the Thorn family was known simply as Grandma Thorn. She lived in a cabin deep in the woods, far from any road or neighbor, where the trees formed a wall against the world. She was described by those who knew her as having an otherworldly appearance, her eyes sharp as knives, her hands cold as the creek in winter. Grandma Thorn lived in a cabin deep in the woods along Otter Creek, a place where even the birds seemed to fall silent. I'd found old letters, yellowed and brittle, that spoke of her in whispers, how she could make crops fail with a glance, how livestock dropped dead if you crossed her. Local residents reported that she could curse livestock, and the stories weren't just gossip. Farms withered, animals sickened, and folks who spoke against her met with accidents no one could explain. I followed the path to where her cabin once stood, now just a pile of rotted logs overtaken by vines. Grandma Thorn was widely believed throughout Clay County to be a genuine witch. The locals didn't throw that word around lightly. It carried weight, fear, and a truth no one could deny. She seemed to take pride in the fear and respect that her alleged powers commanded. I found a journal, hidden in a descendant's attic, that hinted at her rituals, dark ceremonies under moonless skies, offerings that no Christian would dare make. According to local legend, Grandma Thorn had climbed to the top of a high hill overlooking Otter Creek. There, she'd done the unthinkable, cursing the heavens and calling on forces older than the mountains themselves. The ritual involved Grandma Thorn firing a gun through a white handkerchief, and they said the cloth bled, a sign her pact was sealed. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like it remembered her footsteps. I could almost see her, standing on that hill, her shadow stretching impossibly long. the air crackling with something unholy. The journal spoke of blood, of a deal that changed her, made her more than human. I didn't want to believe it, but the deeper I dug, the more the stories lined up. Too many to dismiss as superstition. This wasn't just folklore. This was a darkness that had taken root, and I was standing in its heart. From that moment forward, Grandma Thorne was no longer merely human. She was a force, a shadow that loomed over Clay County. Her name a warning to anyone who valued their life. The community around Otter Creek lived in constant fear of Grandma Thorne, tiptoeing around her, offering gifts to keep her wrath at bay. I spoke to an old man, his hands trembling as he recalled her, how she'd walk into town, and folks would scatter like leaves in a storm. They also maintained an uneasy peace with her, knowing that to challenge her was to invite ruin, but that peace broke when a man named Samuel Morrison vanished, and the truth started clawing its way out. I sat by the creek, the water cold against my fingers, and tried to piece together what happened to Samuel. The air felt heavy, like it was holding on to his story, refusing to let it go. I found records of search parties, desperate families combing the hills, but they found nothing, no trace, no sign. Samuel was a good man, loved by all, with no reason to disappear. But Grandma Thorne knew something. She always knew too much. And that was her mistake. Samuel Morrison was a well-respected member of the community. When he failed to return home from a trip to town, the town turned upside down. Searching for him, no trace of Samuel Morrison was ever found. But Grandma Thorne started talking, dropping hints about where his body lay, details only a killer would know. She demonstrated knowledge about Morrison's fate that she could not possibly have possessed. She'd mention places in the woods, describe his last moments with a clarity that chilled the blood. When pressed for details about her knowledge of Morrison's disappearance, she claimed visions, spirits whispering to her in the night. But the town wasn't buying it. Community members began to whisper that the old witch had finally gone too far. I found a letter from a preacher, warning that her knowledge wasn't divine, it was damning. She described the exact location where his body could be found. And that was the spark that lit the fire. The whispers grew louder, the fear turning to anger. I could feel it, standing there in the ruins of her cabin. The weight of a community pushed to its breaking point. They'd lived under her shadow too long, and now they had proof she wasn't just a witch. She was a murderer. I found stories of meetings in secret, of men with rifles planning in the dark. The creek seemed to hum with their resolve, a current of justice running through the valley. Within a week of Grandma Thorne's revelations, she was gone. The old woman was found dead in her cabin, killed by a single gunshot. It was clean, precise, like the mountains themselves had passed judgment. No one in the community claimed responsibility for the shooting, and no lawman came knocking. The people of Clay County had settled it their way. I walked the creek bank, imagining that night, the shot echoing through the hollow, the silence that followed. The circumstances surrounding Grandma Thorne's death raised as many questions as they answered. Who pulled the trigger? Some said it was Morrison's kin, others a group tired of living in fear. The identity of her killer remained a mystery. I found no records of an investigation, no trace of justice beyond that single bullet. The fact that she could be killed so easily suggested her powers were a lie, or maybe they'd abandoned her when she spoke too much. The old man I spoke to swore the devil had left her, that her pact was broken the moment she betrayed it. The cabin's ruins felt alive, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I heard stories of lights flickering along the creek, of voices in the wind calling for vengeance. Folks said Grandma Thorne's ghost still walks these banks, her eyes glowing in the dark. I didn't believe in ghosts, but standing there, I felt watched, like the trees themselves held a grudge. Booger Hole wasn't just a place, it was a wound, one that never healed. The location where these events took place continued to have a sinister reputation. People avoided it, spoke of strange sounds, of shadows that moved without a source. Some people claimed to have seen the ghost of Grandma Thorne, her figure drifting through the mist, searching for those who ended her reign. I dug through archives, old journals, and tales passed down by firelight. Professor Patrick Gaynor's documentation confirmed this wasn't just a story, it happened. His interviews with elderly residents of the area confirmed many of the details. The Thorne family's shadow stretched long, their legacy a mix of fear and truth. The Witch of Booger Hole case represented a classic example of how isolated mountain communities dealt with threats, in a place with no sheriffs, no courts. Justice was a bullet in the night. The killing of Grandma Thorne was seen not as murder, but as a necessary act of community self-defense. The mountains don't forget, and neither do the people. I left Booger Hole with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Grandma Thorne's story wasn't over. Her name still lingers, a warning carved into the hills. Every creak of a branch, every ripple in the creek feels like her. Waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that by telling this story, I've called her attention to me. The story of the Witch of Booger Hole continues to be told in Clay County. A lesson in what happens when you dance with darkness. It's not just a tale, it's a truth, one that lives in the shadows of Otter Creek, waiting for someone else to step too close. Story number 7. I was a prosperous Protestant farmer who had built a successful life for myself and my family on our property, near what is now Charlestown, West Virginia. My name's Adam Livingston, and back in the 1790s, I prided myself on hard work and a faith that needed no frills. I trusted in tangible things, good soil, hard work, and the Protestant faith that had sustained my family for generations. But one winter night, everything I believed was turned upside down. A stranger came to my door, shivering and sick, and what followed would haunt me for the rest of my days. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of our farmhouse. I opened the door to find a man barely standing, his face pale and feverish. The man was clearly ill, weakened by travel and suffering from what appeared to be a serious fever that left him barely able to stand. His eyes pleaded for help, and I couldn't turn him away, following the mountain tradition of hospitality that was sacred throughout the region. We immediately welcomed the stranger into our home, providing him with food, warmth, and a comfortable place to rest while he recovered from his illness. But as I helped him to a chair by the fire, I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. Over the next few days, his condition worsened. As the stranger's condition worsened over the following days, it became clear that he was not merely suffering from a common illness, but was in fact dying. He spoke in weak bursts, his voice heavy with fear. In his lucid moments, the man revealed that he was a devout Catholic and expressed his desperate desire to receive the last rites of his church before he passed away. I listened, but my heart sank. I had no particular animosity toward Catholics, but like many Protestants of my era, I viewed Catholic rituals and beliefs with skepticism and considered many of their practices to be unnecessary superstitions that had no basis in true Christian faith. I figured my prayers would do just as well. I wrestled with his request. Adam Livingston found himself in a difficult position. The nearest priest was miles away, and the snow made travel treacherous. I believed that such ceremonies were unnecessary superstitions that had no real power or meaning, and I was reluctant to go to the considerable trouble and expense of locating and bringing a Catholic priest to my remote farm. I offered him comfort, praying over him in my own way. I attempted to comfort the dying man by offering Protestant prayers and spiritual consolation, genuinely believing that these would be sufficient, but his pleas grew desperate, his eyes wild with fear. The stranger continued to beg for Catholic last rites until his final breath, dying in a state of spiritual anguish and despair. We buried him on our land, thinking it was done. The stranger was buried on the Livingston property in what seemed to be a respectful and proper manner, with Protestant prayers offered over his grave and a simple marker erected to commemorate his passing. But peace didn't last. Supernatural phenomena began manifesting on the property almost immediately after the stranger's burial. At first, it was just noises, footsteps in empty rooms, doors moving on their own. Family members began hearing strange noises throughout the house at night. I told myself it was the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. The disturbances grew bolder. Objects began moving on their own throughout the house, with furniture sliding across floors, dishes flying off tables, and personal belongings disappearing only to reappear in impossible locations. Chairs would shift in the night, papers scattered across the floor. The family would wake in the morning to find their possessions scattered throughout the house, as if an invisible intruder had ransacked their home during the night. My wife, Mary, grew pale and weak. Mrs. Livingston began to suffer from a mysterious illness that seemed to have no natural cause or cure. She'd collapse, feverish, muttering about shadows watching her. She experienced severe weakness, persistent fever, and episodes of delirium that left her bedridden. Fear took root in our home. Mysterious fires began breaking out spontaneously throughout the property, appearing without any apparent source of ignition. Flames would flare on clothes in the closet, leaving the wood untouched. Clothing would burst into flames while hanging in closets. Yet the wooden closet itself would remain unburned. Papers burned on my desk, but the wood stayed cool. Papers would ignite on desks while the wooden desk surface showed no signs of heat damage. The fires came and went, leaving only smoke and dread. The fires would appear suddenly, burn intensely for a brief period, and then extinguish themselves just as mysteriously as they had begun. Months passed, and we were unraveling. The Livingston family's ordeal continued for months, with the supernatural phenomena showing no signs of diminishing. Neighbors came, wide-eyed, witnessing chairs move and fires spark. Many of these visitors left as believers, having personally observed furniture moving without human intervention. Sleep was a memory, our lives dictated by fear. The psychological toll on the Livingston family was enormous. I, who'd always trusted reason, was lost. Adam Livingston, who had always prided himself on his rational, practical approach to life, found his worldview completely shattered. One night, a dream changed everything. Adam Livingston experienced a prophetic dream that would ultimately provide the key to resolving the haunting. A priest in black robes walked toward our farm, his presence calming the chaos. The priest in the dream had a kind but serious demeanor and seemed to radiate an aura of spiritual authority and peace. I woke certain it was a sign, following the guidance provided by his prophetic dream. Adam Livingston began searching for a Catholic priest who matched the description. I found Father Dennis Cahill, a man who matched my vision perfectly. His search led him to Father Dennis Cahill, a Catholic priest whose appearance and demeanor exactly matched the priest from Livingston's dream. When Livingston approached Father Cahill and explained the supernatural phenomena plaguing his household, the priest immediately understood the spiritual significance. Father Cahill came to our farm, his presence steady and sure. Father Cahill conducted a thorough investigation of the phenomena, interviewing family members and witnesses, examining the physical evidence of the supernatural activity. He prayed, studied, and concluded the stranger's unrest was the cause. Father Cahill concluded that the stranger's spirit was indeed responsible for the haunting, trapped in a state of spiritual unrest because he had been denied the Catholic last rites. The ritual was our salvation. Father Cahill performed the proper Catholic burial ceremony for the deceased stranger, providing the spiritual rites that had been denied to him in life. The air shifted as he prayed, the weight lifting. The moment the ceremony was completed, all supernatural activity on the Livingston property ceased immediately and permanently. Mary recovered overnight. Mrs. Livingston's mysterious illness disappeared completely. and she made a full recovery within days of Father Cahill's intervention. The fires stopped. The house grew quiet. The supernatural fires stopped occurring. Objects remained in their proper places. And the strange noises that had plagued the household for months fell silent. I was changed forever. The profound impact of this experience on Adam Livingston cannot be overstated. I saw the power of the rites I'd dismissed. The man who had once dismissed Catholic rituals as meaningless superstitions had witnessed firsthand the power of proper spiritual observance. I converted to Catholicism. Devoting my life to the Church, Livingston converted to Catholicism and became one of the most devoted supporters of the Catholic Church in the region for the rest of his life. I gave 38 acres of my land to build Priestfield, a place of peace. He donated 38 acres of his land to the Catholic Church, specifically requesting that the property be used for religious purposes. Priestfield stands today a testament to what happened. The Priestfield haunting case was extensively documented by Catholic Church officials and became part of the official record of supernatural phenomena recognized by the Church. Some visitors still feel something, a quiet presence, or clothes cut into crescent shapes. Some guests at the retreat center have reported hearing unexplained sounds, particularly what sounds like scissors or shears cutting through fabric. I know the stranger's soul found peace, but the land remembers. The Priestfield haunting remains one of the most compelling and well-documented cases of religious, supernatural phenomena in American history. Story number 8. I'm Harold Jenkins, and I spent 30 years digging coal out of the Appalachian Mountains, my hands as black as the tunnels I worked in. Those mines were my world. A labyrinth of rock and shadow where I knew every turn, every seam, like the lines on my own palm. But there were places down there, deep in the earth, that even the bravest of us learned to avoid, not because of cave-ins or gas leaks, those we could handle. No, these were tunnels that felt wrong, where the air was too heavy, where you'd swear something was watching you from the dark. This is the story of what I saw in those depths, and what took men I knew, good men, into places no one should ever go. I was 25 when I first went underground. Cocky and sure I could handle anything the mountain threw at me. Coal mining was the lifeblood of our Appalachian towns, pulling families like mine into its grip for generations. We weren't just workers, we were explorers of a hidden world, reading the rock like a book, knowing when it was safe and when it wasn't. But some shafts, they didn't play by those rules. They had a reputation, passed down in whispers over beers after shifts. Tunnels where men vanished, where the walls seemed to hum with something alive. I didn't believe it at first, just old miners' tales. Then I saw it for myself. It was 1978 and I was working a mine in southern West Virginia. Bobby Hutchinson and his nephew Michael, two of the best miners I knew, went missing that year, and Bobby could navigate a tunnel blindfolded, never lost his way. Not once. They were sent to check a reopened shaft, one sealed for months but cleared as safe. I remember them heading in at 7:30 a.m., carrying gas detectors, oxygen tanks, and radios to stay in touch. They were laughing, joking about grabbing a burger after the shift. By noon, they were gone. Their last radio call came at 9:15, Bobby saying they were heading deeper to check some uninspected areas. His voice was steady, no hint of trouble. Then, silence. I joined the search team, crawling through those tunnels for days. We found Bobby's hard hat a quarter-mile from where he last checked in. Michael's gas detector in a side passage he had no reason to be in. The radios were scattered, like someone had torn them apart and tossed them. The tunnel itself was wrong. It stretched farther than any map showed, into chambers that weren't in the surveys. The air was cold, too cold, and sounds didn't echo right, like the walls were swallowing them. I felt it then, a weight pressing on my chest, like the mountain didn't want us there. We kept going, but every step felt like walking towards something that wanted us gone. Some of the old-timers said those tunnels weren't just rock, they were doorways. They told stories of shafts that went too deep, connecting to places no man was meant to find. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there. Footprints in the dust, leading into passages no one had mapped. Tools left where they shouldn't be, like the miners had walked off, drawn by something we couldn't see. I started hearing things. Faint voices, calling my name from the dark. Not my crew, not my friends, something else. Something old. I kept it to myself, but I wasn't the only one who felt it. The search for Bobby and Michael lasted a week, one of the biggest in West Virginia history. We brought in rescue dogs, gas sensors, listening devices, everything. Nothing explained it. No cave-ins, no gas leaks, no flooding. The tunnel was stable, but it wasn't right. We found chambers that looked carved, not blasted, with strange patterns in the rock, swirls and lines that didn't belong. One guy, a veteran rescuer, said he felt dizzy, like the tunnel was shifting under his feet. Another swore he saw a shadow move. Too tall to be human, I didn't see it. But I felt it, a presence, like the mountain was alive and angry. The company said the Hutchinsons got lost, maybe hit bad air in an unmapped section. That was nonsense. Bobby knew those tunnels better than anyone. Their gear was scattered, like it was meant to be found. A trail leading nowhere. I kept thinking about those extra passages, the ones that weren't on any map. They didn't look like mine work. Too smooth, too perfect, like they'd been there before we ever started digging. I started asking around, talking to other miners. Every mine had a story like this. Men vanishing, tunnels going too deep, air that felt wrong. It wasn't just our mine, it was the whole damn region. I never forgot Bobby and Michael Barry, but it was a few years later, in 1982, that I saw it again. Thomas Garrett, a buddy of mine, disappeared in a Kentucky mine, working a routine job on ventilation gear. Tom was steady, the kind of guy who'd done the same job 100 times without a hitch. He went in alone, said he'd be back in an hour. When he didn't show, I was on the search team again. We found his tools scattered, his lunch pail in a passage that hadn't been there the week before. His footprints led deeper, into the dark, like he'd been called. The search was brutal. 5 days, no sign of Tom beyond those footprints. They just stopped, like he'd stepped off the edge of the world. We found more of those unmapped tunnels, cold and silent, with walls that didn't look right. I started noticing details. The rock wasn't just coal and shale. It had veins of something metallic, glinting in our headlamps. One of the younger guys said it felt like walking into a church, sacred and wrong at the same time. I didn't argue, I heard it again. My name. Faint, from somewhere deep. Told myself it was the wind, but there's no wind that deep underground. The old-timers had their theories. They said some shafts tapped into places older than the mountains, places that didn't belong to us. They spoke of tunnels that called to you, pulling you deeper until you couldn't turn back. One old man, half blind from years underground, said he'd seen a miner walk into a wall, like it opened up and swallowed him, and I didn't believe him then, but I kept thinking about Tom's footprints, how they ended in nothing. I started keeping a journal, writing down every story I heard, every warning about bad shafts. It wasn't just superstition, it was survival. The company sealed that shaft after Tom vanished, said it wasn't worth the risk, but we knew it wasn't about cave-ins or gas, it was something else. Families stopped letting their kids follow them into the mines. Mothers begged their husbands to find other work, terrified they'd be next. I stayed, but I was careful. I avoided certain tunnels, the ones where the air felt thick, where my lamp flickered for no reason. I started seeing things, shadows that moved too fast, shapes that weren't there when I turned. I told myself it was fatigue, but I knew better. I'm in my 80s now, long retired, but the mines never left me. My hands are still stained, my lungs heavy with coal dust. I can still feel those tunnels, the way they pressed in, like they were alive. The disappearances never stopped, even after I left. I hear from younger miners, from explorers who poke around the old shafts. They find things, footprints in dust that hasn't been touched in decades. Tools left like offerings. One guy found a helmet, pristine, like it was placed yesterday, in a mine closed since the 90s. I've been mapping it, trying to understand. Every mine had its bad shafts, tunnels no one talked about officially but everyone avoided. I've got a notebook full of stories, names, dates, places. They're all the same. Experienced miners, safe tunnels, no trace. I've talked to paranormal investigators, guys with fancy equipment. They say the tunnels mess with their gear. Compasses spin, cameras fail, audio picks up voices that shouldn't be there. One team found a passage that went half a mile deeper than any survey, with carvings in the rock, old as the hills themselves. I think about Bobby, Michael, Tom, all the others. Did they get lost, or were they taken? The old-timers were right. Some places aren't meant for us to tour. Those tunnels go somewhere else, somewhere beyond the maps. I've heard stories of miners who came back years later, not aged a day, talking about places they couldn't describe, and I don't know if I believe them. But I want to. I keep listening, hoping one day I'll hear from Tom, from Bobby, from someone who made it out. I tell this story because someone needs to know. The mines took more than coal. They took our people, our peace. I'm not a believer in ghosts, but I believe in those tunnels. They're not just rock and earth. They're something older, something that doesn't want us there. I warn the young ones now, the ones who think they can handle anything. Stay out of the deep shafts. Listen to the old stories. Respect the mountain, because it doesn't respect you. The families of the lost never stopped hoping. Some still leave flowers at the mine entrances, praying for answers. The companies moved on, digging new pits, leaving the old shafts to rot, but they're still there, waiting, and somewhere, in the dark, those tunnels are still open. Calling to anyone foolish enough to listen, I'll keep telling this story, for Bobby, for Michael, for Tom, because as long as we remember them, they're not truly gone, and maybe, just maybe, someone will find the truth hidden in the depths. Story number 9. I stood alone in the shadow of St. John's Church. The Blue Ridge Mountains looming like silent sentinels under a moonless sky. The air was thick with the scent of old earth and pine, the kind that clings to your soul. I'd come to Vol.64 to study the graves, to trace the stories etched in stone. But as I stepped into the cemetery, a chill ran through me. Not from the cold, but from the feeling of eyes watching. Then I saw them, 2 glowing red orbs, burning through the fog, staring right into me. The darkness moved, not like a shadow, but like something alive. Something that didn't belong to this world. It was a dog, bigger than any I'd ever seen. Its black fur swallowing the moonlight, those eyes. God help me. They weren't animal eyes, they were fire, pulsing with a knowing that made my knees buckle. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as the creature stepped closer. Silent as death. This wasn't just a dog, this was something ancient, something guarding this place. I'd heard the stories everyone in Vol.64 had. The demon dog, they called it, a beast that haunted St. John's Cemetery, protecting the dead from the living. But stories don't prepare you for the real thing. The air grew heavy, like a storm about to break, and a sulphurous smell stung my nose. The creature didn't bark, didn't growl, it just watched, its gaze pinning me to the spot. I wasn't supposed to be here, and it knew it, that my heart screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The graves around me seemed to pulse, as if the ground itself was alive. I'd come to photograph headstones, to capture history, but now I was part of something older, darker. The dog's eyes burned brighter, casting red light across the stones, making them dance like they were waking up. I raised my camera, desperate to prove this was real, but the air turned cold. so cold it burned. This wasn't just a guardian, it was a judge, and I was on trial for trespassing in its domain. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped by those eyes. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't work right in that cemetery. The dog moved closer, not running, but gliding, like it was part of the shadows themselves. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, knowing I'd crossed a line no one was meant to cross. This creature wasn't here to harm me, it was here to warn me. But warn me of what? The answer lay in the graves, in the secrets this valley had kept for centuries. Valle Crucis, whose name means Valley of the Cross in Latin, sits nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina. I'd come to this place as a student, chasing stories for my thesis on Appalachian folklore. The valley has been considered sacred ground for thousands of years, first by the Cherokee people who recognized the area's spiritual significance, and later by Christian settlers who established St. John's Church in the mid-1800s as a beacon of faith in the remote mountain wilderness. The church was a humble stone building, its walls weathered by time, surrounded by oaks that stood like guardians. The church and its surrounding cemetery occupy a site that local Cherokee tradition identified as a place where the veil between worlds was particularly thin. I'd heard whispers about the demon dog from locals in Boone, tales of a creature that haunted the cemetery. The first documented encounters with the demon dog date back to the late 1800s, when local residents began reporting sightings of an enormous black dog with glowing red eyes that appeared to patrol the cemetery grounds during the darkest hours of the night. They said it wasn't just a stray, it was something else, something that didn't belong to our world. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons, not then, but I was curious, maybe too curious for my own good. I packed my camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, and drove to St. John's under a starless sky, ready to debunk the legend. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The cemetery that surrounds the church contains graves dating back to the earliest European settlement of the area, with weathered headstones marking the final resting places of pioneers, farmers, and mountain families. I started photographing headstones, their inscriptions barely legible under moss and time. The air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something. I worked my way to the older graves, where the oaks grew thickest, their branches weaving a canopy overhead. That's when I felt it, a prickle on my neck, like I was being watched. Both students later reported feeling an intense sensation of being observed, a prickling awareness that made the hair on their arms stand up. The feeling grew stronger, a weight that made my hands shake. The creature first appeared as a shadow, moving between the headstones, a darkness that seemed somehow more solid and substantial than the ordinary shadows cast by trees and monuments in the moonlight. I turned, expecting a deer or a stray dog, but what I saw stopped my heart. It stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder and appeared to weigh several hundred pounds, with a massive head and powerful build that suggested strength far beyond that of any ordinary canine. Its fur was blacker than the night, absorbing light like a void. As the demon dog turned its attention toward me, its eyes began to glow with a brilliant red light that seemed to burn with supernatural fire. Those eyes weren't just looking at me, they were judging me, peeling back my intentions like pages in a book. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The glow was not the simple reflection of light that might be seen in the eyes of a normal animal, but rather an internal illumination that pulsed and flickered like flames. The air turned cold, a sulphurous smell filling my lungs. The air around them grew noticeably colder, and both reported smelling a strange, sulphurous odor that seemed to emanate from the creature itself. I raised my camera, hands trembling, and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the cemetery, and the creature moved, not running, but gliding, its body flowing like liquid shadow. The demon dog began moving toward the students with a fluid gliding motion that seemed to defy the normal laws of physics. I bolted, my heart pounding as I stumbled over roots and headstones. Faced with this supernatural pursuit, Mitchell and Thompson abandoned their equipment and fled the cemetery as fast as their legs could carry them. I reached my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I'd come to study history, but I'd found something alive, something that didn't want me there. The next morning, I returned to retrieve my camera. When the students returned to the cemetery the next morning to retrieve their abandoned equipment, they found their cameras and recording devices scattered among the headstones. The photos were ruined, overexposed, but a few showed strange shapes, dark forms between the graves, and one chilling image of red eyes glowing in the dark. In one particularly chilling image, what appeared to be the glowing red eyes of the creature watching them from the shadows. I dug deeper, talking to locals who'd lived in Valley Crucis for generations. Local families who had lived in Valley Crucis for generations shared stories that had been passed down through their families about encounters with the demon dog. They told me about a caretaker from the early 1900s, a man who'd seen the dog many times. According to family oral tradition, Whitman's grandfather had encountered the demon dog on multiple occasions during his years of caring for the cemetery grounds. He believed it protected the graves from vandals, only appearing to those with bad intentions. The grandfather reported that the creature would appear whenever strangers visited the cemetery with ill intentions, driving away those who came to steal from graves or damage headstones. The stories were too consistent, too detailed to dismiss. I learned that the Cherokee had long considered this valley sacred, a place where spirits crossed into our world. According to Cherokee beliefs, certain locations serve as gateways or crossing points between the physical world and the spirit realm. The dog, they said, was a guardian, not evil, but ancient, tied to the land itself. The Cherokee concept of spirit dogs or supernatural canines that serve as protectors of sacred sites is well established in their oral traditions, but knowing that didn't make it less terrifying. Those eyes, that presence, it was like staring into something older than time. I started to notice changes in myself. Sleep came hard, and when it did, I dreamed of red eyes watching me from the dark. The cemetery had marked me, left something inside me that wouldn't let go. Locals said I wasn't the first. People who have seen the creature report that the experience changes their understanding of reality and their relationship with the supernatural world, and some felt closer to the sacred, others haunted. I was somewhere in between, caught between awe and fear. I kept researching, digging through old church records and newspaper clippings. Dr. Adams found newspaper accounts and church records that documented sightings dating back to the 1890s. The descriptions never changed. A massive black dog, red eyes, a presence that froze you in place. The creature was always described as an enormous black dog with glowing red eyes, always seen in or around the cemetery, and always inspiring the same intense fear and supernatural dread. Some called it a demon, others a divine protector. Some have viewed the creature as a demonic entity, while others have interpreted it as a divine guardian sent to protect the cemetery. The dog seemed to choose who it appeared to. This protective aspect of the demon dog's behavior was confirmed by other witnesses who reported that the creature seemed to distinguish between different types of visitors to the cemetery. Respectful visitors were left alone. Troublemakers weren't so lucky. People who came to pay respects to deceased family members or to conduct legitimate research were generally left alone. It was like the dog could see into your soul, knew why you were there before you did. I went back to the cemetery, not to provoke the dog, but to understand it. Contemporary visitors to St. John's Church Cemetery continued to report encounters with the demon dog. I sat quietly among the graves, feeling the weight of the place. The air was different here, charged with something I couldn't name. I didn't see the dog again, but I felt it, watching, waiting. This wasn't just a story. This was a force, a guardian that had stood watch for centuries and would stand watch long after I was gone. The more I learned, the more I respected this place. The Valle Crucis demon dog represents one of the most enduring and well-documented supernatural guardians in Appalachian folklore. It wasn't just a creature. It was a symbol of something bigger, something about the line between life and death, respect and recklessness. The creature's role as guardian of sacred ground speaks to fundamental human needs for protection, respect, and reverence in the face of forces that are greater than ourselves. I still carry that night with me. Many witnesses describe feeling as though they have been marked or chosen by their encounter, carrying with them a permanent awareness of the presence of forces beyond normal human experience. The cemetery changed me, made me see the world differently. Those red eyes, that sulphurous smell, they're part of me now. A reminder that some places hold secrets we're not meant to unravel. If you ever visit Valle Crucis, tread lightly. The creature's continued presence serves as both warning and comfort to those who understand that some mysteries are meant to be honored rather than solved. Respect the graves, and maybe the guardian will let you pass. But if you don't, you'll see those eyes, and you'll never forget them. Story number 10. The air hummed with a stillness no peace should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim cabin, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I sat by the hearth, the wood creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Ash. Silence. Something watchful. Something that clung to my breath. Something that knew my unease. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive. Its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore, and I was no stranger to quiet. But this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The hum deepened, a vibration threading through the air. A sound that wasn't mine. The faint firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced like warnings. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the armrest, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The cabin wasn't empty, it was full. Brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else. Something that stirred in the stillness. Something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified. The floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet. Its silence a predator. I carried my curiosity, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed. Its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the cabin, a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd dwelled here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to wonder. But this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Moving to our 10th story, we venture onto the most famous hiking trail in America, a 2,190 miles pathway that winds through the spine of the Appalachian Mountains from Georgia to Maine, connecting some of the most remote and mysterious wilderness areas on the continent. The Appalachian Trail has been walked by millions of hikers seeking adventure, solitude, and connection with nature. But for some unfortunate souls, their journey along this ancient path has led them into encounters with something that defies all rational explanation. A presence that seems to stalk certain hikers with malevolent intelligence, leaving behind evidence of its passage that challenges everything we think we know about what lurks in the deep wilderness of these ancient mountains. The Appalachian Trail follows ridgeal lines and valleys that have been traveled by humans for thousands of years. First by Native American hunting parties and trading expeditions, then by European settlers pushing westward into the wilderness, and finally by modern hikers seeking to experience the raw beauty and challenge of America's oldest mountain range. The trail passes through some of the most remote and untouched wilderness areas in the eastern United States, places where cell phone coverage is non-existent, where the nearest road might be dozens of miles away, and where hikers can walk for days without encountering another human being. It is in these isolated stretches of trail, far from civilization, and help that the most disturbing encounters with the Appalachian Trail stalker have occurred. Mark Stevens has worked as a trail safety coordinator for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for over 15 years, a position that has given him access to thousands of incident reports, missing person cases, and unusual encounters reported by hikers along the trail's entire length. Stevens is a practical man who deals with tangible dangers, bear encounters, severe weather, medical emergencies, and the occasional criminal activity that can threaten trail users. However, his years of reviewing incident reports and investigating unusual occurrences have convinced him that there are patterns of activity along certain sections of the trail that cannot be explained by conventional wilderness hazards or human criminal behavior. The cabin's pulse was a spark, its whispers a truth that lingered in my unease, a truth that followed me to the investigation. The air trembled with a weight no knowledge should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim trail, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I walked the path, the earth creaking with a scent I couldn't place, leaves, mist, something probing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my search. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to facts, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The weight deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint trail markers flickered, casting shadows that danced like watchers. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the notebook, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The trail wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my inquiry, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the trail a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd traversed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to patterns, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. According to Stevens and the extensive database of incident reports maintained by the Trail Conservancy, there are specific sections of the Appalachian Trail where hikers have reported being followed by an unseen presence, encountering disturbing messages and drawings left at campsites, and experiencing a sense of malevolent surveillance that seems to persist for days or even weeks as they continue their journey. These reports come from experienced hikers who are familiar with normal wilderness sounds and wildlife behavior, people who understand the difference between natural phenomena and something genuinely unusual or threatening. The pattern of stalking behavior typically begins subtly, with hikers reporting a vague sense of being watched or followed as they walk along isolated sections of trail. Initially, Most hikers dismiss these feelings as natural paranoia or the psychological effects of spending extended time alone in the wilderness. However, as the stalking continues, the evidence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Hikers report hearing footsteps that seem to parallel their own movement through the forest, always staying just out of sight, but maintaining pace with their progress along the trail. When they stop to listen, the footsteps stop as well. When they resume hiking, the sounds of pursuit resume with them. What makes these encounters particularly disturbing is the intelligence and persistence displayed by whatever is following these hikers. Unlike wildlife, which typically avoids human contact or follows predictable behavioral patterns, the Appalachian trail stalker seems to study its targets, learning their habits and routines before making its presence known in increasingly obvious and threatening ways. The trail's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my search, a truth that followed me to the pattern. The air swelled with a pressure no explanation should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim forest, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I moved through the trees, the undergrowth creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Moss, fear, something assessing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my determination. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to evidence. But this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The pressure deepened, a vibration threading through the air. A sound that wasn't mine. The faint forest light flickered, casting shadows that danced like pursuers, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the recorder. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The forest wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet. Its silence a predator. I carried my analysis, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the forest a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd vanished here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to patterns. But this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Hikers report finding their campsites disturbed during the night, with gear moved or rearranged in ways that suggest careful examination rather than random animal interference. Food is sometimes taken, but not in the messy, destructive manner typical of bears or other wildlife. Instead, items are removed selectively and precisely, as if the stalker is sampling or studying the hiker's supplies. One of the most documented cases of Appalachian trail stalking occurred in 2018 when a solo hiker named Jennifer Walsh reported being followed for over 200 miles along sections of the trail in Virginia and West Virginia. Walsh was an experienced long-distance hiker who had completed several major trails and was familiar with normal wilderness conditions and wildlife behavior. Her detailed journal entries, which she shared with trail authorities after her experience, provide a chilling day-by-day account of escalating stalking behavior, initial feelings of being watched, discovery of disturbing messages and drawings, and increasing psychological pressure that eventually forced her to abandon her hike. Walsh's ordeal began during her third day on a section hike through Shenandoah National Park, when she first noticed the feeling of being watched while hiking through a particularly remote stretch of trail. Initially, she attributed the sensation to natural wilderness paranoia, but as the day progressed, she began to notice signs that someone or something was indeed following her. She found footprints in muddy sections of trail that appeared shortly after she had passed, prints that were too large and oddly shaped to belong to any known wildlife, but didn't quite match human footprints either. On her fourth night, Walsh made camp at a designated shelter area and was awakened around 200 a.m. by sounds of movement outside her tent. When she listened carefully, she could hear what sounded like someone or something moving slowly around her campsite, stopping occasionally as if examining her gear or studying her tent. The movement was too deliberate and careful to be wildlife, but when she called out to challenge what she assumed was another hiker, there was no response. The sounds continued for over an hour before finally stopping, leaving Walsh too frightened to leave her tent until daylight. The forest's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my determination, a truth that followed me to the encounter. The air groaned with a dread no reason should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim camp, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I examined the site, the ground creaking with a scent I couldn't place, soil, darkness, something probing, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my skepticism. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to facts. But this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The dread deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint camplight flickered, casting shadows that danced like intruders, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the journal, but the shadows faded. The light dimming, the silence heavier. The camp wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else. Something that stirred in the stillness. Something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified to tong. The ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my logic, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery, and I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the camp a canvas of lives, spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd camped here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to analysis, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The next morning, Walsh discovered that her campsite had indeed been visited during the night. Her hiking boots, which she had left outside her tent, had been moved several feet away and arranged in a precise pattern that seemed intentional rather than random. More disturbing still, she found a series of strange markings scratched into the dirt around her tent, symbols or drawings that looked almost like primitive pictographs, but didn't match any Native American or historical markings she was familiar with. The drawings seemed to depict a human figure being followed or pursued by a larger, more ambiguous shape. As Walsh continued her hike over the following days, the stalking behavior escalated dramatically. She began finding more elaborate messages and drawings left at campsites and trail junctions, always appearing overnight or during periods when she had stopped to rest. The messages were disturbing in their specificity. Some included details about her hiking route that suggested her stalker had been observing her for days, while others contained personal information that should have been impossible for a stranger to know. One particularly chilling message carved into a wooden trail sign read, "Jennifer stops for water every 2.3 miles, a reference to her personal hiking rhythm that she had never shared with anyone. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched and followed began to take a severe toll on Walsh's mental state. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at normal forest sounds, and becoming increasingly paranoid about every shadow and movement in her peripheral vision. Sleep became nearly impossible as she lay awake in her tent, listening for signs of her stalker's presence and wondering what new message or threat she might find in the morning. The camp's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my skepticism, a truth that followed me to the message. The air shattered with a silence no understanding should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim peak, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood at the summit, the rock creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wind, finality, something assessing, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my fate. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore, and I was no stranger to conclusions. But this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The silence deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint peak light flickered, casting shadows that danced like verdicts, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the air, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The peak wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the space stretching behind, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my reflection, a frail shield against the unknown. But the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze vanished, the peak a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd reached here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to destiny, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched and followed began to take a severe toll on Walsh's mental state. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at normal forest sounds, and becoming increasingly paranoid about every shadow and movement in her peripheral vision. Sleep became nearly impossible as she lay awake in her tent, listening for signs of her stalker's presence and wondering what new message or threat she might find in the morning. The climax of Walsh's ordeal came on her 8th day of being stalked, when she discovered a message that demonstrated knowledge that no human stalker could possibly have possessed. Left at her campsite was a detailed drawing that depicted not only her exact location and the contents of her backpack, but also included a sketch of a tin container with a note that read, "This was the last thing Sarah ever saw." The reference to someone named Sarah was completely inexplicable. Walsh knew no one by that name, had never mentioned such a person in her journal or conversations, and could find no logical explanation for how her stalker could have known about anyone named Sarah. When Walsh reported this incident to trail authorities, Stevens and his team conducted an extensive investigation that included searching missing person databases for any hikers named Sarah who had disappeared along the Appalachian Trail. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. There was indeed a record of a hiker named Sarah Mitchell who had vanished without a trace along the same section of trail where Walsh had been stalked. But Sarah's disappearance had occurred over 3 years earlier, and the case had never been solved. There was no way that Walsh could have known about Sarah's disappearance, as the case had received minimal media coverage and was not widely known even among regular trail users. The investigation into Walsh's stalking experience revealed that similar incidents had been occurring along various sections of the Appalachian Trail for decades, with remarkably consistent patterns of behavior reported by different hikers in different time periods. The Trail Conservancy's incident database contained dozens of reports describing the same progression of stalking behavior: initial feelings of being watched, discovery of disturbing messages and drawings, and increasing psychological pressure that often forced hikers to abandon their planned routes and seek help from trail authorities or local law enforcement. The reports are most common in the most remote and isolated sections of the trail, particularly in areas where the trail passes through old-growth forests or follows ancient Native American pathways. Some researchers have noted that stalking incidents seem to cluster around areas where the trail intersects with other unexplained phenomena, such as locations where cryptid sightings have been reported or where unusual disappearances have occurred. The seasonal patterns of stalking incidents also suggest that the phenomenon may be influenced by environmental or temporal factors that are not yet understood. Stalking reports are most common during the late fall and early winter months, when fewer hikers are on the trail and the forest canopy is bare, providing better visibility for surveillance. Some investigators have theorized that the stalker may be more active during these periods because the reduced hiker traffic makes it easier to focus on individual targets without interference from other trail users. The geographic distribution of Appalachian Trail stalking incidents shows some interesting patterns that may provide clues about the nature of the phenomenon. Stalking reports are most common in the most remote and isolated sections of the trail, particularly in areas where the trail passes through old-growth forests or follows ancient Native American pathways. Some researchers have noted that stalking incidents seem to cluster around areas where the trail intersects with other unexplained phenomena, such as locations where cryptid sightings have been reported or where unusual disappearances have occurred. The seasonal patterns of stalking incidents also suggest that the phenomenon may be influenced by environmental or temporal factors that are not yet understood. Stalking reports are most common during the late fall and early winter months, when fewer hikers are on the trail and the forest canopy is bare, providing better visibility for surveillance. Some investigators have theorized that the stalker may be more active during these periods because the reduced hiker traffic makes it easier to focus on individual targets without interference from other trail users. The peak's pulse was a weight. Its whispers a truth that lingered in my fate, a truth that followed me to the conclusion.